So I've been getting a lot of questions about throwing more accurately in the wind, and the simplest way to think about it that I've come up with is think about the wind as exaggerating the upward and downward motion of the disc. So we all know that a disc has lift. It's not a ball. Like when you throw a tennis ball, there's no lift on it. It just, when you throw a flip-flop, actually this might have lift if I spin it, but I'm just gonna throw it like this. Like there's no flight on that. There's no pressure underneath lifting the flip-flop up. However, a disc, when you throw it, it's similar to an airplane wing. The air that's traveling over the top of the disc is moving faster than the air that's moving underneath, and there's upward pressure generated, which creates lift. Now, that happens whether there's wind or not, but when there's no wind, let's say when there's no wind and we throw it, it's going to have uniform lift in all directions, and that's easy to understand as a player, right? So you're gonna throw the same throw in all directions and it's gonna behave the same, and that's great. The problem is when there's wind. How do we account for that? Well, when we're throwing into the wind, it's like we're throwing farther because the disc is traveling through more air and there's more lift happening to it over a shorter distance when we're throwing into a stiff wind. So to account for that, we actually have to imagine that the target that we're about to hit is actually a lot lower. So we'll probably release lower as well, right? We're gonna release lower, and we're also going to aim lower on our receiver. So we're gonna throw maybe at their waist instead of their chest, and that's going to account for the added lift that the wind is going to put on the disc when we throw upwind. Opposite for downwind. If we're throwing to a target and the wind is at our backs, we need to throw higher, maybe like depending on how stiff the wind is, we might have to throw to the top of their head or something, and there's gonna be less lift on the disc, and it's going to actually drop a lot in the last few feet of its flight. So that's the downwind throw. The upwind throw. Upwind, the disc is going to want to fly up in the air. Downwind, the disc is going to want to drop. What about crosswind? That's super weird. How do we account for that? Well, crosswind is a question of edges. Now, if the wind is moving this way, if we have the edge slightly down, the wind is going to go across the disc and it's going to push the disc down into the ground, which is not ideal. If we have the disc perfectly flat, probably the same thing is going to happen. The disc is going to tend to go down. If we have the disc exaggerated up, a lot of wind is able to get under it, and it's gonna basically, you're probably, if you've Googled this video, you're familiar with the sensation of the disc just taking off 20-30 feet into the air because you released it with a bit more edge on that crosswind throw than you wanted. So I think the ideal throw, crosswind, is whichever throw for you, forehand or backhand, puts that edge slightly up to the direction of the wind. So right now, the wind's kind of gusting all over the place, but if the wind is moving this way, my throw, if I'm throwing to you, I want to tilt that edge slightly up so that the wind helps the disc stay aloft longer. Whereas, like, I might throw a good backhand, not realize I've thrown that slightly edge up throw and have it work out really well, and then I'll throw sort of the same power forehand. And because my forehand is released in such a way as to have this edge down, it'll just hit the ground. It'll be really confusing. So my forehand, I would actually have to account for that, let that outside edge come down if we're still talking about the same wind direction, and have it so that when I release the disc, it's traveling through the air on a slight angle. The wind is letting it sort of fly and float for longer and bank. So in order to practice that, the best way I can think of is have a throwing partner and to get a feel for shorter throws where you're exaggerating a little bit more than you would in a game that tilt on the edge of the disc for crosswind throws, where you're always trying to keep the side of the disc that's into the wind slightly up so that you're getting a little bit more float on the disc, and you want to really take all of those throws out of your arsenal where the wind, if the wind is coming from this way and you know that you throw your backhand with that edge down, you just kind of know that when the wind is traveling in that direction for you, you don't really throw your backhand like that anymore. You now want to adjust to that wind condition and throw your backhand with that edge up. And that's going to be changed by, or influenced by, your defender, right? So if I'm throwing this way, depending on which way that defender is forcing, I might have to sort of pre-decide what type of throw I have to use in that situation. I might have to fake a flick so that I can get that backhand with that edge up. So those are all considerations that have to be made depending on the direction of the wind. And quite often you can be prepared for what types of throws you need to make at the beginning of the point, because a lot of the time you're playing an entire game where the wind tends to be from the same direction. So if it's crosswind, that for me, left to right, that's really good for my flick, because I like to throw that inside out IO flick, and that edge is up, so that disc is going to carry. And for me, my left to right IO backhand is counterproductive because I throw that with that edge up, so I have to do an outside in backhand with those wind conditions. Conversely, if the wind was, for me, traveling from right to left, I now have to keep this edge up to get more bank on that wind that's pushing this way. And then just to recap the wind at your back situation, if I have wind coming from behind me going this way, I have to throw higher than my target so that it can drop and account for that lack of lift. And if I'm throwing into the wind, I have to throw lower on my target because the wind is going to increase the lift on the disc and it's going to want to fly up. So that's the summary of kind of those major directions: into the wind, wind from behind, wind from the left, wind from the right, and having consideration for how the wind is acting upon the disc. And hopefully that fixes at least some of the more egregious errors in your throwing. Head on over to frisbeethrows.com if you want to get the content that I'm putting together for a long bomb crash course where you can just start throwing the disc really, really, really far and just pumping it out there, right? Let's throw some long stuff. Head on over to frisbeethrows.com for those videos.